Have you ever wondered what it would feel like if your child were taken, not in a sudden war or by mistake, but by law? Not for crime, not for school, but as a mathematical certainty, where every village, every year, lost its sons to a system. So regular, it became background noise in the minds of rulers. You might be listening to this in the silence of your room, maybe on a dim night where the walls feel soft and the fan murmurs like an old lullaby. Perhaps you're in Lahore or Lisbon, in a city full of lights, or on the edge of a desert town with nothing but stillness outside your window. Wherever you are, thank you for being here. And if you haven't already, do subscribe so we can keep sharing forgotten stories from a past that rarely sleeps. Tonight, we're not walking into a battlefield or a royal court. We're walking into something quieter, colder, a system of conquest that didn't just capture cities, but slowly dismantled entire civilizations with rules, ledgers, and rituals. The cruelest things Islamic Caliphates did to conquered peoples were not the ones shouted in the heat of war, but those whispered into laws, carved into tax demands, and built into schools where stolen boys were taught to forget the names there. Mothers gave them. Imagine waking up to footsteps measured, official, not hurried, not afraid, just the sound of boots on a dirt road, heading toward your village again. Because it wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. These men came with lists, with quotas. They weren't raiders or rebels. They were state employees, trained to assess teeth and bones, to measure shoulders and count fingers. In Balkan towns and Armenian hillsides, in Ethiopian plains and Persian valleys, the knock on the door came for someone's son, and not by mistake. There was no shouting, just the quiet devastation of mothers being told that their boy was now property of the empire. No ransom, no mercy, no farewell. Some tried everything, hiding sons in cellars, pretending they were sick, breaking their legs, or cutting off fingers to make them undesirable. Others offered gold, goats, land, anything. And many were simply too late. Their boys were already standing in line, being examined like horses. Eyes, posture, reflexes. Intelligence was tested to some with simple puzzles, others with questions about faith or numbers. The smarter the boy, the more likely he was to be taken. That alone tells you something chilling. This wasn't about brute labor. It was about reprogramming the best minds of a generation to serve the very system that had erased them. One of them became Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire. His name had once been Sakalovic, a Serbian boy. Taken. At 10, trained in silence, he returned decades later as Sakalu Mehmed Pasha. He didn't visit his village as a guest. He came as the one giving orders. He had a bridge built there across the Drina River. Some say it was a gift. But the truth is it made it easier for the next wave of officials to cross and take more boys. This wasn't rare. It was the system. Families weren't just broken. Villages disappeared. In some places, every boy between 8 and 18 was taken. The fields stopped growing. The churches stopped singing. Homes stood half-built and then fell apart. Archaeologists find plates still on tables, grain still in bins. What kind of disaster leaves dishes behind? Not fire, not war. A silence that took children and waited for the old to die. But these children weren't just taken, they were remade. They were forbidden to speak their native language, given new names, taught the Quran, trained to fight like no one else in the world. And then they returned not as sons, but as janissaries, the elite, the feared, the very weapon of empire. They came back wearing uniforms, pointing rifles at the houses they once called home. A 14-year-old boy might return at 34, now tasked with collecting the next generation of children. He might stand in front of the same woman who once sang him lullabies and not flinch. You might think that's impossible. that a soul would shatter before it forgot so completely. But the truth is, breaking souls was part of the method. Isolation was the first step separating boys from anyone who shared their tongue, their memory, their rituals. Then came immersion. Language, religion, drills, punishments for speaking the old words, rewards for obedience. Over time, the old names became foreign. The old gods became lies, and the new ones promised power. One boy, taken from near Visegrad, had tried to keep a piece of bread from his mother, a goodbye gift. The soldier slapped it from his hand. He never saw her again. 40 years later, he commanded the very soldiers who slapped bread from new hands. It worked like a wheel, and the wheel turned for centuries. But children were not the only ones caught in its spokes. There was another, group-grown men who met a fate even worse. If child theft were a machine, castration would be the furnace it fed. Imagine a practice so cruel that it had a 90% mortality rate and continued for over 1,000 years. Boys were marched across deserts, thousands of them, chained, silent, bleeding feet on burning sands. They weren't heading to freedom. They were heading to facilities that did not heal, only cut. The goal was simple: remove any threat of rebellion, of dynasty, of family. Castration turned men into objects. Eunuchs couldn't father children, couldn't claim family ties, couldn't build a tribe, and so they were safe for palace service, for guarding harems, for holding positions near women or rulers without risk of lineage. But the price of making one such man was the death of 9 others. The centers processed thousands every year. Archaeologists have found the graves mass pits filled with boys between ages 7 and 25. Some still wore shackles. Others had died of infection or simply bled out. It wasn't just medieval ignorance. Byzantine medicine had safer methods. They were known, but they were ignored, because high mortality made the survivors rare, and rare meant valuable. One merchant's ledger reads like a spreadsheet of horror. Bought 100 Nubian boys, lost 91 to the procedure, sold 9 at triple the price. Net profit, success. He didn't name them. He didn't warn them. He counted them. That's what this system did. It turned people into numbers, into inventory. And those numbers rolled into policy, tax, and tribute. Some Christian kingdoms had to send 400 slaves a year. Every year, for centuries. Not gold, not grain. Human bodies. Delivered like parcels. Tracked like shipments. Over time, those communities vanished. The villages emptied. The languages died. The temples grew weeds. What do you call a genocide that leaves no bones? A cultural one. And the most efficient cultural weapon of all was the tax. We think of tax as annoying lines, forms, percentages. But in these empires, tax was a tool sharper than any sword. Christian farmers paid up to 80% of their harvest. Not profit, harvest. What remained couldn't feed a family, so their children starved or converted. One boy, seeing his siblings starve, converted to Islam to save them. The family survived, but he couldn't inherit the farm. Islamic law forbade that, so the land passed out of their hands forever. Survival today meant extinction tomorrow. The mathematics worked perfectly. It punished the faithful and rewarded the converted, not with kindness, but with crumbs. They even taxed fixing churches, using bridges, and drawing water. 1,000 little wounds, none fatal, all weakening. Over time, families grew smaller, shrines crumbled, and languages slipped away. You didn't need war to destroy a people, just math. But perhaps the darkest chamber in this long corridor of cruelty was reserved for women. That part of the story, as quiet as it is horrifying, waits for us ahead. And yes, it gets worse. But for now, take a breath. Maybe your eyes are heavy. Maybe your room is a little colder now. Or maybe just quieter. Either way, this was only the beginning. Because while the numbers were horrifying, the real story of how one scar could save a girl from something far worse is waiting in the next chapter. Let's keep going. The most disturbing rituals are yet to be whispered in the soft hush of early dawn, before any birds have dared to sing and the sky is still the color of ash. Imagine a quiet town along the Black Sea coast, where the mist drifts low like a veil, and the stones remember the sound of weeping. A place where fishermen used to mend their nets near the port, where bakers once warmed dough in clay ovens, where children ran barefoot through alleyways long since emptied, but on certain days documented, scheduled, and approved. Those alleyways became corridors of sorting, and the port transformed into the cruelest kind of marketplace. In this silence, the softest voices vanished first. Girls between the ages of 12 and 16, pulled from homes with such efficiency that even the neighbors stopped looking out their windows. The Crimean slave port of Kaffa wasn't a chaotic place. It was precise. 20,000 women moved through it every year, each stripped, inspected, catalogued, and assigned value. The buyers came from every direction: Ottoman envoys, wealthy merchants from Damascus, palace agents from Cairo, even private collectors with particular tastes. Age, skin tone, and facial symmetry all documented. Slavic girls, especially Circassians, fetched the highest prices, not because they were rare, but because their beauty had been weaponized by rumor, art, and centuries of greedy memory. Their faces, once kissed by mothers, became investments. And when they arrived at the Topkapi Palace harem in Istanbul, the paperwork followed them. Invoices, medical checks, virginity confirmations. 12 girls aged 13 to 16, of good health and obedient temperament. This wasn't whispered in shadow. It was stamped, recorded, and archived. They were not concubines in silks, lounging in fantasy. They were broken children, with new names, erased origins, and the constant fear of pregnancy. A child from a slave could mean favor or death. Some girls elevated mothers of princes. Others were murdered by rivals or poisoned before they could rise. The palace was not a dream of luxury. It was a pressure chamber where silence meant survival. And if escape was attempted, the punishments were not invented in rage. They were written in policy. One girl, listed in a harem ledger as Aishi Georgian, age 19, was caught trying to flee. The record beside her name reads only: standard punishment applied. Deceased day 3. Nothing more. Not even her real name. Outside the palaces, in villages where daughters were still free, mothers began doing something both unthinkable and completely logical. They scarred their children. Cut faces, burned cheeks, anything to reduce their market value. In Circassia, entire communities held scar ceremonies. One folk song, passed down in secret, sings, "My daughter, forgive the knife. I give you freedom in your face." The act was love turned into a blade. The logic was horrifying. A girl disfigured might survive at home. A beautiful one would vanish. Russian accounts from the 19th century record, finding whole villages of women with marked faces, not by birth or war, but by maternal protection. But not every daughter could be saved. The demand was endless. Harems across empires needed new faces. As one tired, another arrived. The process never paused, because the empire's appetite for silence wore perfume and draped itself in velvet. And when the sultan died or grew bored, the women weren't released. They were often murdered quietly, quickly, without ceremony. Their stories did not pass into legend. They passed into the ledgers. Even more disturbing were the smaller harems and provincial mansions, where girls were rented like property or given as diplomatic gifts. The law permitted it. Consent didn't. exist. A slave could be shared, sold, or reassigned. The only regulation was price and appearance, and this was legal for over 1,000 years. But perhaps the most efficient erasure of identity was in the way names were assigned. Slaves were called Amina or Zulika, unless the owner allowed it. Most were simply renamed by region. Georgian, 3. Sudanese, 7. Slavic, 12. You cannot trace a life when the name is a number. But where were their children? That question has no museum answer. Most were aborted or killed. A few survived some rose in rank. Others vanished into the imperial fog. There is no diaspora, no memory carved in stone, only whispers. And yet, the same policies existed across the caliphates. From Andalusia in the west to the Mughal courts in the east, the rules were the same. As many female slaves as you could afford. Religious law meticulously written, covered every scenario, how to sell them, how to pass them to heirs, how to assign their children. It read more like a guide to livestock than anything human. And what about the girls who survived long enough to age? They were often discarded, gifted to servants, or resold for menial labor. Beauty had a shelf life, and memory did not travel with them. But sexual slavery wasn't the only thing these empires industrialized. They turned language into silence, religion into ash, identity into ghosts. Entire civilizations disappeared, not with fire and sword, but with erasure. In Persia, Zoroastrians watched their sacred fire temples desecrated. Some flames had burned for centuries tended like children. Then came water, poured deliberately by men who laughed as they doused the millennia. The priests were given choices: convert or die. 40,000 of them were killed in a single decade. Those who fled carried fragments of their texts sewn into clothing, hidden under floorboards, whispered across seas to India. They became the Parsis, survivors, but not many. The Avesta, their holy book, exists today only in pieces. We have more of Shakespeare than of the religion that once stretched from the Indus to the Aegean. The same fate met the Buddhists of Central Asia. The Nalanda University once held 9 million texts. It was the Oxford of the ancient world. When it burned in 1193, the fire lasted 6 months. Monks were tied to manuscripts and burned alive. The ruins show layers of ash, bone, and melted ink. Afghanistan, now known for its mountains and war, was once a kingdom of quiet monks and massive carved Buddhas. Now only fragments remain, half statues, vandalized sanctuaries, empty silence. These were not natural declines. They were policies. They were exterminations not of people, but of memory. And in Egypt, Coptic, the language that descended from the speech of the pyramids, vanished one law at a time. First, it was banned in courts, then in markets. Then it became suspicious to speak about it in public. Eventually, children stopped learning it. The last native speaker died in the 17th century, alone, unnoticed. 5,000 years of unbroken language, ended not with an explosion, but with a whisper fading into the night. So what do you call a system that can remove entire languages? Without fire, you call it perfect. And it wasn't just language. It was art, tradition, law, belief, architecture, and names all slowly unstitched. In Andalusia, the Jewish community once thrived under early Muslim rule, but taxes rose every generation 35%, and 45%, and 70%. Laws changed slowly. You can't own land. Now you can't hire Muslims. Now you must convert. Eventually, the only ones left were those too weak to leave or too frightened to speak. The slow strangulation worked better than war. One generation learned to hide. The next forgot what was hidden. The last didn't know there was anything to remember. This is how silence becomes permanent. But silence was not just policy, it was performance. In Damascus, Christian and Jewish taxpayers had to kneel in public once a year to pay jizya. As they knelt, they were struck on the neck, a symbolic blow. Their children watched. Some fathers practiced taking the blow at home so they wouldn't cry in public. One man wrote in his journal, "Today I knelt for the 23rd time. My son watched. I saw in his eyes the moment he chose to convert. I cannot blame him. The violence was not in the strike. It was in the memory passed down, like a sickness that had no cure. And the cruelest trick? Some of these people were not conquered enemies. They were born into the empire, paid their taxes, obeyed the laws, and still they had to kneel. Still, they had to be reminded who ruled. And what about those who resisted? Some villages fought, that tried to push back. One in Armenia KB refused to pay new taxes. The penalty: every 10th man executed, taxes raised again, children taken. Within 5 years, the population dropped 90%. By the 6th year, the village was empty, a ghost where once there was bread, laughter, and bells. And across the empire, this pattern repeated like a lullaby of extinction. Each village was a verse. Each generation is a fading echo. And you might ask, where were the scholars, the poets, the voices that might have recorded the loss? Many were killed. Others were reprogrammed. A few tried to remember, but their words were buried in archives, untranslated, unread. But there is more, always more. Because in this great system of erasure, there was one engine that kept everything running. It wasn't soldiers or swords. It was money. And that part of the story, that quiet machinery of wealth built on human suffering, whispers to us next. And it's even colder than you expect. Let's continue. Because the ledgers still speak. Picture an old room, dimly lit by oil lamps, where the smell of parchment and dust clings to the air like an old prayer. Along the walls, rows of leather-bound ledgers rest in silence, pages filled not with poetry or law, but with numbers that measured lives. There is no blood on the paper, no screams in the ink, only neat columns, carefully calculated profits, and quiet entries that tell you everything if you know how to read them. In the empire's vaults, tax records from the 10th century lie beside shipping invoices for human cargo. Letters from palace bureaucrats beside lists of the recently castrated, all filed with the kind of order that suggests pride rather than shame. These weren't secret crimes. They were budget items. You can trace the flow of a child's life from one ink mark to the next, his name struck out, replaced by a code, his region of origin abbreviated, his market value noted, his physical flaws underlined. One ledger from Damascus begins with purchased 100 Nubian boys at 45 dinars each, followed by a meticulous cost breakdown. Transport, 500 dinars. Castration, 200. Deaths, 91. Survivors, 9. Sale, price per survivor, 175. Net profit, 275. Dinars, and it ends with a flourish, a small mark beside the total satisfaction. The merchant made money. That was the point. The boys were not people. They were inventory. But this wasn't the exception. The exception. It was the formula. In Cairo, similar ledgers survive from the Aswan castration centers. Every year, 3,000 to 5,000 boys are processed. Not rescued. Not healed. Processed. The same language is used to describe grain, spices, or livestock. Archaeologists have unearthed burial sites near these centers, rows of small skeletons, almost all between the ages of 10 and 16, most showing signs of trauma, infection, or malnutrition. There were no names carved into stones, just bones piled in silence. The Ottoman Empire's archives, still carefully preserved, contain entire sections devoted to the slave markets of Kaffa, Tripoli, Damascus, and Zanzibar. Pages listing healthy. Girls ages 12 to 16, fair complexion, compliant, recently acquired. And in the margins, notes about buyers. A governor in Syria looking for domestic staff, a merchant in Baghdad requesting replacements for lost inventory, a palace requesting. 4 Saracen girls for the harem must be virgins. Even price fluctuations were recorded. When famine hit Georgia, prices for young girls dropped by 20%. When a war disrupted the Nubian pipeline, eunuchs became scarce and prices tripled. Supply and demand. This was the true genius of the system, not in its violence, but in its order. Every cruelty was regulated, every horror standardized. But tax, not just on people, but on life itself, was the quietest weapon of all. It didn't scream, it didn't bleed, it starved. In Egypt, Coptic Christian farmers in the 10th century worked fields they had inherited from their fathers and grandfathers. The soil was rich, the Nile was kind, but the tax was constant. 70% of the harvest taken, not of profit, but of total yield. That left 30%, but some of that grain had to be saved for next year's planting, and some was lost to spoilage. What remained fed 8 people barely. When a child died, the tax records made note, not out of grief, but because it affected future revenue. One register reads, 3 children of brothers, the farmer, died this winter. Expected revenue reduced accordingly. Another entry lists, family unable to meet quota, the eldest son converted, tax reduced, land now held under Islamic title. This wasn't a conquest, this was erosion. 1,000 small disappearances, generational starvation, slow inheritance theft. And the law was patient. It didn't need to convert everyone today. It could wait, one child at a time. And with every conversion, the weight shifted. Under Islamic law, Muslim families paid far less. They could save, build, inherit. The system wasn't just biased, it was mathematically rigged for extinction. Imagine 2 potters, one Muslim, one Christian, both skilled, both hardworking. But one pays 10% tax, the other 60%. The Christian must charge more. Customers leave. He cannot afford better tools. He cannot train his son. Eventually, he converts. Not for faith, but for food. And when he does, he loses the right to inherit his father's land. So the land is sold, the family name fades, and the culture takes one more quiet step toward erasure. The jizya tax was more than money. It was a performance. In cities like Damascus, Christians and Jews paid it in public, on their knees. A ritual, humiliation, a ceremonial reminder of their status. One man, after 20 years of paying, wrote, "My son watched this year. He did not speak after. Next year, I expect him to kneel beside me or convert." The ceremony was meant to do just that, break the father in the eyes of his child. And over time, it did. One man's conversion might mean his grandchildren never knew their origin. 500 years later, those families were Muslim. Their churches are gone. Their language is forgotten. Their memories are dust. In one Armenian village, a tax increase of 90% led to protests. The response was immediate. Every 10th man killed. Taxes raised again. Children taken. Within 5 years, the population dropped 90%. By year 6, the village was listed in imperial records as non-productive. That meant empty. But taxes didn't just destroy the poor. They also erased the wealthy. In Andalusia, Jewish merchants once ran thriving businesses, but laws changed slowly. Taxes increased yearly. Property was confiscated. Profitable trades were banned. By the 3rd century of Muslim rule, Their economic base was gone. And then came the massacre. Survivors were expelled. It hadn't happened overnight. Each generation faced just a little more restriction. The slow boil, the quiet trap, and all of it documented. Each change is written. Each law is justified. Inheritance taxes sealed the fate. A Christian could pass wealth to his son if the son didn't convert. But the taxes were so high, the estate would be lost. If the son did convert, he couldn't inherit under Islamic law. Either way, the chain was broken. Muslim families built wealth. Christian and Jewish families reset too. Zero every generation. Compound interest in reverse. But it wasn't just taxes on income. There were bridge taxes, road taxes, church repair fees, and even taxes on drawing water. Each one is small. Each one is survivable. But together, they became impossible. Dead. Men don't pay taxes, but desperate men will do anything. And the system counted on that. Even the military exemption tax played a part. Christians and Jews paid extra not to serve in armies that would raid their people. A grotesque form of pay to avoid participation. But perhaps the most intimate theft was of memory itself. When language was banned in courts, in trade, in public, it didn't vanish overnight. But children learned to speak the language of survival. The old tongue became something whispered between grandparents, then in church, then nowhere. When the last Coptic speaker died, an entire lineage died with her. A language spoken since before Moses, gone. And it was the same in Persia, in India, in Central Asia. Sanskrit silenced. Zoroastrian prayers forgotten. Buddhist texts burned. The pattern held, slowly, reliably. The system didn't need war. It needed only time. But what funded all this? Slave sales. Tribute. Rents on stolen land. One official in Cordoba calculated yearly tax returns from non-Muslims with surgical precision. Revenue predictable. Resistance minimal. That was the goal. Not fire. Not rebellion. Quiet compliance. Measured starvation. And it worked. For over 1,000 years. And even when resistance came slave revolts, famines, disappearances, the archives remained. The math survived. And that's why today we know so much. Because the bureaucrats never stopped writing. The ledgers of paying were kept in perfect order. And the most haunting detail? The names are missing. Only numbers, only codes, only silence. But there's more. Because not all suffering came from coins or chains. Some came from prayers, the forced kind. The kind that began as fear and ended in forgetting. The kind where the old God is replaced not by belief, but by necessity. And that part of the story, the conversion by starvation, by punishment, by ritual, is just beginning to unfold. Now imagine a narrow alley at dawn, lined with old stones darkened by centuries of breath, where the only sound is the distant clatter of sandals and a murmur too tired to be called speech. A father stands beside his son at the entrance to a mosque, not because of faith, but because there is no grain left, and the taxman has already circled their home twice this month. Inside, the boy does not yet know the prayer, but he mimics the movements. His father does not correct him. There is no time for doctrine, only for survival. This was how conversion happened, not by sudden lightning, but by a long erosion of hunger and humiliation. You did not become Muslim to be holy. You became Muslim. Your children hadn't eaten in 2 days, because your neighbor had been fined for speaking his mother tongue too loudly in the market. After all, the inspector saw your daughter and lingered too long at the door. And when you converted, the system welcomed you like a gate that had always been open. Your taxes dropped. Your name changed in the registry. Your children could now enter certain schools, work certain trades. But your dead father couldn't be buried in a Muslim cemetery. Your ancestral land would still be taxed as Christian property until the paperwork caught up. And your son? He would never learn the stories you had grown up with, because now they were dangerous, forbidden, or simply forgotten. This was not a religion of swords and fire, not in daily life. It was a religion that became law, and the law was shaped like a funnel, wide at the top, narrow at the bottom, and you slid down its shape one hunger at a time. The empire didn't need to kill you. It needed you to walk willingly toward forgetting. One Christian woman in 11th century Egypt wrote a letter still preserved today in which she pleads for permission to repair her village's small church, which had been damaged in a storm. "We will pay the repair tax," she wrote. "We will not place a cross on the roof. We will not ring a bell. A bell." Her tone is not defiant. It is exhausted. She is not asking for freedom, only permission to hold a memory together with broken bricks. The reply, never sent, remains attached to her letter. Permission denied. Further requests will increase. The tax burden. The church was not rebuilt. The village vanished from the maps a generation later. Some conversions were done to protect the living, others to honor the dead, but many happened in silence. A young man pays his tax in public one year, then doesn't appear the next. No one asks. His neighbors see the implication. His head is shaved differently. His sons wear new clothing. His wife no longer wears a cross around her neck. The family name is altered in the records. They are now Muslim, and they are eating better. This was not hypocrisy. This was arithmetic. The calculations were not spiritual. They were biological. In Syria, an entire town converted after a 3-year drought. Their tax was reduced by 60%. Food stores were protected. Their cemetery, once Christian, was slowly repurposed. The headstones were reused. The names were erased. But the system wasn't satisfied with quiet conversions. It needed theater. Every year in major cities, the jizya ceremony took place with deliberate cruelty. Non-Muslims, heads bowed, paid their tax while being struck on the neck, a symbolic blow meant to mirror the executioner's sword. Children watched. Wives watched. The blow was not meant to hurt the body. It was designed to hollow the spirit. Some fathers practiced ahead of time, training themselves not to flinch. "Don't cry," they told their sons. "Just bow. Just breathe." And when the child came of age, he too would kneel. Or not. Some chose never to return. They walked instead into the mosques, into the registry offices, into the new world. Some converted and then turned against their own families. Others remained silent, even while their grandchildren called them strangers in their own homes. But not all stories ended in conversion. Some ended in destruction. In 1562, the village of Kabid refused to meet a tax quota. The response was methodical. Every 10th man executed. The survivors were taxed at 95% for the next 5 years. Children taken into the Devshirme system. The village's weapons were confiscated. Their church was locked and sealed. The cemetery was the only place that grew. By 1566, the population had dropped to less than 10% of its original size. The tax register reads, "Village no longer productive. Resources exhausted." That was the language used. Not grief, not loss. Just exhausted. The same year, a nearby village experienced something quieter but equally fatal. Their taxes had not been raised, but the rules around inheritance had changed. A Christian father could no longer pass his shop to his unconverted son. The shop was sold. The family relocated. The building reopened under new ownership. The sign changed languages, and the memory of that family disappeared like candle smoke in a windless room. The economic warfare was precise, calculated, not just to suppress, but to shape behavior. If resistance was met with violence, compliance was met with a kind of thin mercy. And if you converted, you were absorbed into a system that no longer saw you as them. Now you were ours. The line between them and ours was drawn with ink, not swords. But the ink was more permanent. Over centuries, entire populations shifted. The old faiths became legends. The old names suspicious. The old songs no longer sung. And the children born into this new silence never knew what had been lost. One Coptic priest in the 13th century wrote in his diary, "We are ghosts now. We walk in sunlight, but our voices are memories." His church was later destroyed, but the diary survives. It sits in a museum now, in a glass box, untranslated, rarely read. That's the trick. You don't have to burn memory. You only have to stop reading it. But while religious identity faded through starvation and law, cultural memory was also hunted more violently. Through the destruction of texts, libraries, temples, languages. You've already heard of Nalanda, the Buddhist university that burned for 6 months. But consider also the Hindu temples of India, raised systematically by Mahmud of Ghazni, some containing gold and silver offerings passed down for generations. The Somnath Temple alone held wealth equal to billions today. Its idols were not just broken, they were taken and embedded in mosque steps to be walked on daily. That act was not incidental. It was a statement. Your gods are beneath our feet. And then there were the fire temples of Persia sacred to Zoroastrians, some lit continuously for over 1,000 years. Water was poured onto those flames. Not in haste, not during battle, but in the ceremony. And the priests who tended them were given a choice, bow or die. 40,000 chose death. The survivors fled to India. The flames, once bright, live on in refugee shrines, but only barely. These weren't moments of war. They were policies of silence, calculated endings, designed forgettings. And the strangest thing? These were documented, not hidden, not whispered. The records still exist in archives in Istanbul, in libraries in Cairo, in translations buried in footnotes. What vanished was not the evidence. What vanished was the willingness to look. And that brings us to the part most people cannot speak. About it all, the erasure of women, not only from families, but from history itself. It is a quiet, soft extinction. No battles, no treaties. Only ledgers that list Scashan Girl 14 compliant, purchased. We'll open that ledger next. But for now, if your eyes have grown heavier or if your breath is slower than before, it's all right to let the silence settle. Because what comes next, the bureaucracy of rape, the resale of daughters, the mutilation of girls by mothers trying to save them, is perhaps the darkest sleep history has to offer. Now let us open the quietest of all ledgers, the ones that list no crimes, no protests, no rebellions, only purchases. Rows upon rows of inked entries, measured by compliance, beauty, ethnicity, and silence. These are not documents of theft in the traditional sense. They are inventories of forgotten daughters, processed through systems so vast and so normal that the horror was simply built into the handwriting. Received, 12 Circassian girls, ages 13 to 16, intact, fair, suitable for service. That is not a quote from a novel. It is a surviving palace invoice from the Ottoman harem, preserved under glass in Istanbul's Topkapi Palace. And that is only one of thousands. Because in this chapter of forgotten history, women were not just victims. They were currency. In the slave ports of Kaffa, on the Crimean coast, 20,000 girls were sold annually for over 300 years. That's 6 million women through one single gateway. Kaffa was not a chaotic bazaar. It was an organized center of human commerce. A bureaucratic hub with registrars, tax officials, price evaluators, and document clerks. Girls were stripped, sorted, and categorized by race, weight, skin tone, and reproductive condition. Circassians were the most expensive, the gold standard, as one document coldly puts it. Ethiopians were assigned the lowest value. Slavic girls were especially in demand, sometimes labeled white merchandise, as if the color of suffering somehow made the system smoother. The average age? Between 12 and 16, but many were younger. The most profitable were those newly matured, a phrase repeated with numbing regularity in the Ottoman archives. And for every sale, there was paperwork, receipts, certificates. Of health, notations of obedience. Girls were renamed upon entry. Their birth names struck out. Their documents were stamped with palace symbols. In many cases, they were given names based on the month they were acquired. Shaban, Rajab, Safar, or based on simple descriptors. Tall one, quiet one, third Georgian. These were not identities. They were storage labels. But before a girl reached the harem, she often passed through several hands. Some were sold at provincial markets, others given as gifts to military commanders, wealthy merchants, or governors. Some were rented, yes, rented for short-term companionship. The language used was always precise, always administrative. In one surviving registry from Baghdad, the rental fee for a 14-year-old girl is listed alongside a penalty clause for damage or pregnancy. Another document records a return, unfit for further use. Replacement requested. No crime is mentioned. No trauma acknowledged. Just replacement. But inside the palace harems, life was not stability. It was containment. A woman might rise if she bore the sultan a child, but she might also be poisoned by rivals, silenced by guards, or disposed of without cause. The death rate inside the harem is unknown, but the suicide rate was high. French diplomats housed near the Topkapi compound recorded the screams from within. One ambassador, writing in cipher, said, "We pretend not to hear, not to hear. To hear would make us responsible." Punishment for disobedience was codified. One ledger describes a Georgian girl, age 19, named as she. She attempted escape. The record says only, standard punishment applied. Died day 3. No explanation. No detail, because in this system, the disposal of a life was less important than the preservation of the protocol. But perhaps the most haunting aspect was the attempt by mothers to save their daughters before they were taken. Across Circassia and parts of the Caucasus, girls were deliberately scarred. A slash across the cheek, a burn on the neck, a broken tooth, anything to reduce their appeal. One oral song, recorded by Russian folklorists, repeats the line, "Better you bleed now than be taken clean." Entire villages held what came to be known as scar ceremonies. Mothers would gather, sing lullabies, and make small cuts across their daughters' faces. The scars were not cruel, they were hopeful, and the pain was an offering to the future. Some girls understood, others cried, but all were marked, not for shame, but for protection. The logic was impossible. A scarred girl might be ignored by the slave raiders. A beautiful one would be gone by morning. But the system adapted. Eventually, even scarred girls were taken. They were sold at lower prices, marked damaged on the scrolls, but still processed. The trade did not need perfection, only volume. And so families stopped scarring. Some began hiding girls in cellars or caves. Others sent them away dressed as boys. And some simply gave up. The demand was too high, and the state is too efficient. This wasn't just an Ottoman practice. The same system existed in Egypt, in Basra, in Cordoba, in Delhi. Wherever Islamic empire spread, the trade followed, and the justification was always legal. Religious scholars wrote detailed treatises on the ownership of concubines, the rights of slave owners, the rules for selling, gifting, or even bequeathing female slaves. There were laws on how many a man could own, how often he could have intercourse, and what to do if she became pregnant. Consent was not discussed. It wasn't required. And the children of such unions? Boys were often accepted, especially if acknowledged by the father. But girls faced a darker fate. Many were raised in the harem, only to be resold. Others were killed. Infanticide, though technically prohibited, was practiced widely and recorded indirectly. One Cairo midwife's journal notes, 2 girls delivered today. 1 will be raised. The other, taken away. That phrase, taken away, appears often. It is the softest way to record the hardest things. And still, the market expanded. Harems grew. Not just royal ones, but provincial ones. Wealthy men kept 5, 10, sometimes 50 women. Slaves were bought as investments, not companions. A well-behaved girl might serve for years. A disobedient one might vanish, and no one asked questions. But how did the empire maintain supply? Through raiding, through tribute, through inheritance, and through overland and maritime networks that matched anything the Atlantic trade ever achieved. The Islamic slave trade predates the Atlantic one by centuries and outlasts it by decades. It was legal in Saudi Arabia until 1962. In Mauritania, it wasn't criminalized until 1981. And even today, echoes of that system remain in legal codes, in social hierarchies, in unspoken rules. But the most shocking thing? There are no monuments, no museums, no remembrance days, because the women left no descendants. Their children were killed, absorbed, or erased. Their names were changed. Their languages are lost. Their stories were never recorded. You can count their lives in ledgers. You can find their deaths in burial pits. But you cannot find their voices. And that is the final cruelty. To be used, to be renamed, to be discarded, and then to be forgotten. But we have the ledgers. We have the records. And if we read them slowly, with care, with trembling hands, we can begin to see them. Not as inventory, but as people, as daughters, as memories, and as warnings. Because the system that consumed them was not built in a day. It was perfected over centuries. It was legal. It was admired. And it was very, very quiet. And what comes? Next, after all this, the children taken, the men mutilated, the women erased, what could remain? The final piece of this machine. The part that made it all run. Not the raiders. Not the traders. But the money. The spreadsheets. The economic logic that made cruelty efficient. That is where we'll go next. Into the mathematics of erasure. And the softest kind of genocide. The one that speaks in numbers, not screams. Let's keep going. The silence is still thick with truth. Picture a ledger so cold it could make death seem efficient. A thin sheet of parchment dated 1298. Its ink faded but precise. Numbers neatly organized in lines and rows. It reads like a profit and loss report from a distant corner of hell. Purchase, 100. Nubian boys at 45 dinars each. Transport, 500 dinars. Procedure, castration, 200 dinars. Deaths, 91. Survivors, 9. Sold at 175 dinars each. Net profit, 275 dinars. This wasn't a rare document. It was one of many. Calculations like these filled the offices of merchants, governors, and court officials across Islamic empires, from the Red Sea ports of Suakin to the inland caravan stops of Timbuktu, from the slave markets of Cairo to the counting rooms of Damascus. The trade in human bodies, especially in altered bodies, wasn't simply tolerated. It was optimized. And behind this grotesque arithmetic was something even colder than greed. Logic. Because empires don't run on chaos. They run on systems. And this system turned human suffering into predictable revenue. The economic engine that powered the Islamic world across 14 centuries didn't just rely on conquest. It relied on bondage, taxation, and annihilation wrapped in bureaucracy. Imagine a village deep in the Sudanese interior. A raiding party arrives fast, brutal, organized. They don't burn everything. They don't need to. They take the boys and the youngest girls. They kill the weak, the old, and those who resist. Then they march the captives north overland, through blistering heat, toward the castration centers of Egypt, or the slave depots of Mecca and Medina. Many die on the way, 30 to 40%, according to historical estimates. But that's an acceptable loss, because the survivors will be worth more. The logic was as sharp as a blade. An intact boy might sell for 50 dinars. A castrated one, 150 to 200. Even with a 90% death rate, the math worked. Not because of malice, but because the market demanded it. Eunuchs were in high demand, in harems, in palaces, in mosques. They were considered safe. They couldn't create dynasties, couldn't form families, couldn't betray loyalties through blood. And so they became perfect administrators, perfect guards, perfect servants. And the system needed thousands. But where did the money come? From to fund such a vast network of acquisition and mutilation? Taxes, always taxes. The jizya tax wasn't just symbolic humiliation. It was a financial cornerstone. Non-Muslims, especially Christians and Jews, paid annual head taxes just to exist under the protection of the empire. And the rates weren't fixed. They fluctuated by region, by mood, by political convenience. In some periods, the tax reached 80% of a family's earnings. In others, it was accompanied by additional levies, taxes on marriage, on property inheritance, on trade, on worship. In Egypt, a Christian farming family might produce 100 units of grain per year. 70 would be taken immediately. Of the remaining 30, they would need to save some for planting. The rest barely fed the household. Any fluctuation, drought, disease, war meant starvation. And that, too, was part of the math. Because when you break people with hunger, you don't just make them weak. You make them flexible, more likely to convert, more likely to sell a child, more likely to give up the fight. A converted man would immediately pay less tax. His children could access education. His land, once subject to confiscation, could now be passed down. His life didn't become easy, but it became survivable. And the price of survival was memory. Conversion wasn't a lightning bolt. It was a slow drowning. Each generation lost. A little more. A few more words of the old language are forgotten. A few more holidays are uncelebrated. A few more names changed. Until, eventually, there was nothing left to convert. The system didn't just allow this. It relied on it. Bureaucrats wrote conversions into revenue forecasts. In the Damascus tax records of the 12th century, one note reads, expected conversions, 17. Revenue loss offset by reduced patrol expenses. The clerks weren't interested in theology. They were interested in balance sheets, and the balance always favored erasure. But the jizya wasn't the only tool. There was the Kharaj land tax imposed on non-Muslims, often collected in kind. If a village produced 100 sheep, it might be required to give up 60. If it produced wine or dairy prohibited for Muslims, its entire output could be seized and resold. Markets were regulated by faith, not fairness. Christian potters paid extra to sell their wares. Jewish cloth makers were limited to certain colors, certain markets, and certain streets. And each limitation reduced their competitiveness. Slowly, Muslims became the only ones able to grow, not because of innovation, but because the soil was poisoned for everyone else. Then came the taxes on resistance. When a village refused to comply, the punishment wasn't always military. Sometimes it was economic strangulation. In Kabyd, Armenia, resistance led to 95%. Tax rates. Families were told, convert or die slowly. Many died, a few converted. Within a decade, the entire region had changed demographically, and the empire moved on. One scribe in Baghdad wrote, "Resistance is temporary. Hunger is eternal." He wasn't being poetic. He was being efficient. And yet, somehow, despite the starvation, despite the violence, some communities held on. The Copts of Egypt, the Jews of Andalusia, the Zoroastrians of Persia, the Hindus of India. They survived scarred, smaller, but not gone. They preserved books in secret, built underground churches, sang prayers at midnight when no one could hear. Some buried their sacred texts in clay jars, hoping a future would exist. Read them, and a few were right. In the 20th century, archaeologists unearthed hidden manuscripts in Egyptian caves' Coptic scrolls, so fragile that they crumbled in light. Others found synagogue foundations in southern Spain, temples in Gujarat, and fragments of Zoroastrian ritual near Yazd. The ghosts of these cultures still speak, faintly. But what they say is always the same. We survived, barely. And then some didn't. Cultures so thoroughly erased that no one remembers their names. Languages are not just dead, but extinct. Religions whose last priest died alone in the mountains. Cities whose stones still stand, but whose stories have no mouths to speak them. These are the true victims of the system. Not just the dead, but the silenced, the unremembered, the ones who were reduced to marks in a ledger. Which brings us to the cruelest twist of all. The wealth extracted from these people, these villages, these broken families. It built empires, funded palaces, fed armies, supported the arts, sponsored scholars, and those scholars, some of them praised the very system that enabled this, wrote poems about the glory of conquest, composed treatises on the legal status of slaves, debated the proper etiquette for entering a harem, all while the ground beneath their libraries was soaked in forgotten tears. Today, tourists admire the architecture of Islamic empires. The domes, the tiles, the gardens. Few ask who paid for it. Fewer ask who was broken to make it possible. But the ledgers are clear. The beauty we admire was bought with suffering. And that beauty, though real, has shadows. So many shadows. And yet, there's one more piece to this story. Perhaps the darkest of all. The reason you've never heard of most of this. The reason there are no museums, no heritage months, no remembrance days. The silence wasn't just accidental. It was engineered. And in our next part, we will descend into that silence. Into the ways this history was hidden, denied, or simply made too dangerous to teach. The numbers exist. The bones remain. The ledgers are open. But the truth was buried. Let's unearth it gently, because even buried history can still whisper if you know how to listen. Now let us walk slowly through the softest corridors of denial, the kind that echoes not with screaming, but with the absence of names. A museum in a modern city displays a dazzling robe from the 17th century silk, gold thread, impossibly delicate embroidery. The plaque reads, Ottoman ceremonial garment, worn by high officials during royal processions. No mention is made of the girl who stitched it, her, hands bleeding from long hours under torchlight. No record of the weavers brought from Persia under bondage, their techniques seized, their children sold. The robe is real, but its history is not. This is how forgetting works. Not by destroying every trace, but by curating memory, selecting what survives. The Islamic Empire's powerful, wealthy, expansive, understood this better than most. They did not need to hide the horrors. They only needed to overwhelm them with beauty. Build mosques so stunning that no one asks who laid the bricks. Commission. Poetry so lush that no one remembered who harvested the ink. And above all, write history that the victor's voice. Because every empire knows the pen is cheaper than the sword and lasts longer. In the libraries of Baghdad, scholars compiled grand histories celebrating military triumphs, cataloging rulers, praising conversions. But almost none mentioned the daily torment of the conquered. The ledgers of slave markets are detailed. But the chronicles say nothing about the mothers who walked miles barefoot to ransom a child, or the priest who fasted himself to death outside a locked temple, or the village that forgot its language in 3 generations and didn't even notice. Silence, when orchestrated, becomes architecture. Consider the madrasas, the religious schools that shaped Islamic thought for centuries. Their curriculum included law, theology, grammar, and astronomy, but not the history of the conquered, not the stories of Jews pushed into ghettos, not the Christian bishops forced to sell church silver to pay tax, not the fire temples drowned in their oil. These stories existed, but not in the lessons, not in the songs, not in the halls where power was groomed. And so, a generation grew up not just misinformed, but innocently so. They believed in the glory of conquest because they were never shown the cost. They recited poetry about divine justice, never knowing that a village downriver had vanished under tax and famine. And the result? Empires that remembered themselves as merciful, and populations that believed them. But there were cracks, quiet resistances. A Hebrew manuscript, buried in a jar, discovered centuries later, speaks of the year of dust, when an entire Jewish town vanished after refusing new taxes. A Coptic hymn, banned by Fatimid authorities, was preserved in whispers and sung only during childbirth, in candle-lit rooms where no guard would hear. A Zoroastrian fire temple, officially closed, kept its flame hidden behind a barn wall, tended by 3 generations of women, none of whom could read the old prayers, but remembered the movements by heart. These are the memories that didn't die. They just went underground, but even memory has limits. By the 18th century, many original communities were gone. Some fled, others converted, and many simply withered under pressure. But the absence was never marked. There are no plaques in Cairo saying, "Here once lived 40,000 Copts, driven out by economic law." No markers in Granada, where synagogues once stood. No museum wing devoted to the girls sold at Kaffa, or the eunuchs buried in unmarked graves behind the palace kitchens. And so, the forgetting continued, not out of malice, but out of comfort. Because to remember cruelty, especially when it is dressed in architecture and law, is to risk seeing ourselves as less noble than we wish. And yet, there is one more layer, one more silence, the modern one, the textbooks, the documentaries, the tourist guides, the university courses. All of them, in varying degrees, tiptoe around this past. They speak of Islamic civilization with, its art, its learning, its tolerance. And to be fair, these things existed. The libraries, the scholars, the mathematics, the poetry. But rarely do they speak of what was lost to build them. Rarely do they name the enslaved. Rarely do they quantify the vanished. And when they do, it is often brief, buried in footnotes, softened by language. Decline in non-Muslim population. Shift in cultural dominance. Integration through conversion. These phrases are technically correct, but they taste of ash because they erase the ache. They erase the terror of being the last Zoroastrian in your village, the last Hebrew speaker in your neighborhood, the last Christian to light a candle in a sealed chapel. This erasure, too, is part of the system, a second erasure layered atop the first, not of people, but of their memory. And it has consequences. Today, ask someone about the Atlantic slave trade, and most will recall its horrors. Ships, chains, whips, museums have been built, memorials erected, reparations debated. But ask about the Islamic slave trade, and silence follows. Not because the evidence is missing, but because the will to look is weak. The truth is heavy. It complicates cherished narratives. And so we whisper it, if at all. But truth, once whispered enough times, begins to rise. Like smoke, like memory, like a hymn returning to lips that forgot its words. And this, perhaps, is the gentlest resistance. To remember. To say their names, if only softly. To imagine their stories, even when the ledgers are all we have. Because the silence they were buried under is not invincible. It cracks, it trembles, and one day it may even shatter. But before that happens, we must ask what allowed such silence to thrive for so long. What social habits, what theological justifications, what legal mechanisms kept this past hidden in plain sight? That is where we go next, into the religious and intellectual scaffolding that built the illusion of mercy while practicing erasure. And if your eyes are still open, breathe gently, because we are now entering the part of history that was not only hidden but defended, fiercely, calmly, systematically. And still it is ours to uncover. Let's keep walking together, quietly. Now, let's step into the most polished chambers of this historical silence, the ones lined with books, ruled by law, and guarded by men and rogues not of war, but of wisdom. These were not the arenas of swords and screams, but of scrolls and sermons. And here, in these soft halls of knowledge, some of the most enduring justifications for cruelty were gently laid down. Because empires don't just conquer by force. They conquer by interpretation. And when Islamic empires expanded across continents, they didn't just build roads and palaces. They built a theology of dominance, quiet, precise, and terrifyingly durable. Imagine a scholar seated on a fine carpet in 10th century Baghdad. His inkwell is ivory. His fingers were stained with pomegranate-colored dye. He is writing a fatwa, not a political command, but a legal opinion. The question posed is simple. What is the proper treatment of a rebellious dhimmi? His answer is long. It quotes scripture, narrations, and older scholars, all meticulously. The conclusion: a dhimmi who rebels may be killed, enslaved, or forced into greater taxation as a lesson to others. It is the right of the ruler to decide what best serves the ummah. This wasn't an aberration. It was a pattern. Jurists across centuries debated in calm, authoritative tones how to manage the conquered. Who could be enslaved? When a church could be demolished, what colors Jews were allowed to wear in public, and whether a Christian woman's testimony could be accepted in court. And the answers were not whispered. They were published, memorized, reiterated in sermons, not always with malice, but always with clarity. Take, for instance, the Pact of Umar, a document attributed to the second caliph, but formalized over centuries. It laid out the obligations of non-Muslims under Islamic rule. They were not to build new houses of worship, not to raise their voices during prayer, not to ride horses in the presence of Muslims, not to dress like Muslims, not to display crosses, ring bells, or teach the Quran to their children. These terms were accepted as the price of peace. But peace here meant obedience, and the law ensured that obedience was legally correct, socially visible, and theologically justified. But perhaps more disturbing than the law itself was the way scholars could beautify it. One theologian wrote, "The mercy of Islam is in its guidance. By taxing the disbeliever, we return him gently to the truth. Another, to enslave is not cruelty, but guardianship over the weak, who do not yet know the path. These words were written with confidence and with clean hands, because violence, once written down in eloquent prose, no longer looks like violence. It looks like an order. But what happens when a religion that began with a spiritual revolution is slowly institutionalized into a machine of dominance? It adapts. It codifies inequality not as an accident, but as divine design. And so the jurist smiles, believing he is upholding justice, even as a child is sold because her village didn't pay enough tax. A merchant signs a receipt for a eunuch, believing he is securing honor, not participating in mutilation. A scribe lists conversions by region, unaware that each number is a memory drowned. And the people? They adapt too. They stop resisting openly. They whisper instead, or they forget, or they leave. And those who remain must navigate a world where the law is layered scripture, interpretation, tradition, local custom, royal decree. Each layer adds a filter. And somewhere between God and man, justice is lost. But what of the scholars who resisted? There were a few, marginalized, mocked, silenced. One Andalusian poet dared to write, "If God is just, then what is this chain?" His work was banned, his books burned. Another, a jurist in Delhi, argued that the jizya should be voluntary, as true faith cannot be coerced. He was removed from office. His tomb today is visited only by birds. And yet, the machinery endured, because theology is powerful. It shapes not just rules, but desires. In time, even the conquered believed they were being treated with fairness, that their silence was noble, that their erasure was inevitable. This was not stupidity. It was survival. When your son is safer as a Muslim, when your taxes vanish with a single word, when your neighbors disappear one by one, belief becomes strategy, and the law is always watching. One document from 14th century Cairo reads, "A dummy may not display joy during Eid. It offends the faithful." Another from Aleppo, "A Jewish man's house painted in bright colors is to be dulled. He must show humility." These are not criminal codes. They are emotional blueprints. They regulate not crime, but mood, not threat, but presence. Because the greatest danger in an empire of theology is not rebellion. It is visibility. And so the erasure became ornamental, layered under carpets, folded into architecture, hidden in the margins of calligraphy. The truth was always there, just not invited into the light. And what about the historians? The ones tasked with recording everything? Most chose caution. They praised the rulers, omitted the vanished, romanticized the conquests. One wrote, "1,000 churches closed in peace as their worshippers saw the light." Another, "The tax paid by infidels is their gratitude for our rule." These sentences were not lies. They were lullabies, designed to let the reader sleep while history burned. And sleep, once widespread, becomes tradition. That's how we arrived here centuries later, with museums full of beauty and minds empty of pain, with textbooks that show maps of expansion, but no ruins of memory, with faiths that remember their triumphs but not their shadows. And yet, the pages still exist. In vaults, in libraries, in family records passed down like forbidden songs. And those pages tell a different story, not of rage, but of erosion, not of war, but of bureaucracy, and not of monsters, but of men who believed they were good. And in the next part, we'll explore that belief, how ordinary people, teachers, traders, poets participated in this system, not because they hated, but because they conformed, not to kill, but to live. So if your eyes are still open, soften them now, because we are about to enter the gentlest cruelty of all, the kindness That blinds. And the comfort that forgets. Let's keep walking. Quietly. Now, let us step softly into the most ordinary rooms of all the kitchens, workshops, schoolyards, and courtyards of the Islamic world, where cruelty did not wear armor or quote scripture. It wore aprons. It brewed tea. It bought bread. And in these everyday places, the vast machinery of erasure continued not by force, not even by law, but by rhythm, daily rhythm. And the most frightening truth in all of this? Many who upheld the cruelty had no idea they were doing so, because the most efficient form of injustice is the one that feels normal. Imagine a baker in 11th century Damascus. He rises before dawn, recites a prayer, kneads his dough with salt, water, and faith. His neighbor is a Christian. The baker does not hate him. He greets him with a nod. But he also knows that if this Christian man enters his bakery, he must do so with head bowed, voice low, coins in hand, not just because of tax, but because it is expected. The baker was taught, quietly, that non-Muslims must display humility. And so, without anger, he serves the bread with less warmth. Without violence, he hands back the change with no eye contact. It is not hatred. It is customary, a polite cruelty, so soft it feels like dust. Multiply that by thousands. Now picture a school teacher in Cordoba. She instructs her students in poetry and Quranic recitation. One child lingers after classes. Name is David. His family is Jewish. He is intelligent, curious, and gentle. The teacher praises him, but when she marks his notebook, she never gives the highest score. Not because she dislikes him, but because it would be unseemly for a Jew to outperform Muslim students. She was taught this by her mentor, who was taught by hers, and so on. It is tradition. It is subtle, but David notices. And he learns, not about arithmetic, but about limits. Now think of a seamstress in Cairo. She embroiders robes for wealthy clients. One day, she's asked to add gold thread to a gown for the Jew. Vizier's wife. It's delicate work. As she stitches, a Christian servant walks past, taller, well-dressed, her posture elegant. The seamstress stiffens. She has been told that dhimmis must not walk proudly in the presence of believers. She does not speak, but her needle moves faster, a little more tightly, and she prays under her breath, not for harm, but for order, because that's what she believes the world must have, order, even if it means some must shrink. None of these. People is our villain. They are simply alive within a system that rewards quiet compliance. And slowly, they build their walls one gesture at a time. A smaller portion of soup, a step aside on the road, a reminder that you may not wear green or ride a horse or enter by the front gate. Each act is small, but the accumulation is vast. And what happens to those who resist? Not with swords, but with memory. A Christian scribe who copies forbidden texts in the back of his shop. A Jewish midwife who continues rituals for babies, though the state has banned them. A Zoroastrian who still lights his sacred fire in the privacy of his courtyard. Their resistance is not loud, it is careful, quiet, and sometimes fatal. A tax official visits, notices something. A fine is issued. A neighbor whispers. A soldier arrives. A child is taken. A license revoked. The punishment is rarely dramatic. It is administrative. You are erased through paperwork, through the denial of permits, through the closing of gates, through the unspoken agreement that your name shall not appear on the roster. One Armenian poet wrote in exile, "They killed U.S. with ink, not iron." He wasn't exaggerating. Many people who vanished from the record didn't do so by execution. They simply stopped being counted. And when the next generation came, there was nothing to inherit. No land, no titles, No books, and slowly, no stories. And what about the converts? Those who changed faith not by revelation, but by fatigue? Their path was smoother. They received less tax, more access, a place in the mosque, but they often paid with silence. They abandoned old songs, burned books, hid family relics. Their parents wept in private, proud their children would survive, but grieving what was lost. One letter from 13th century Egypt tells of a Jewish father giving his son a final blessing. You will have a good life now, but you will forget my father's name. That was the cost. Not death, but forgetfulness, a deeper kind of loss. But perhaps the hardest truth to face is this. The system didn't require monsters. It thrived because of nice people. Kind neighbors, generous scholars, courteous traders, people who believed they were righteous, who prayed, gave charity, and still participated in a structure that slowly crushed others under the weight of soft rules. That is the cruelty hardest to name, because it wears a smile. And so when we look back at this history, we must do so with trembling, not only for the victims, but for ourselves, for the ways we too might conform, might nod along, might participate in something unjust, simply because it is dressed in tradition, in faith, in community. The lesson here is not to hate, but to listen. And in the next part, we will return to the voices rare, fragile, mostly hidden, that resisted. This quiet cruelty, the poets, the scribes, the martyrs, those who refuse to forget, and perhaps those whose whisper can still reach us now. So rest your eyes if they grow heavy, but let your ears stay soft, because in the silence, there, voices are waiting, still singing, still resisting. Now let us kneel beside the few who whispered when shouting would have meant death, the scribes who inked truth in the margins, the poets who stitched protest into metaphor, the singers who turned lullabies into subversion, and the women who remembered rituals not through words, but through hands, gestures, fire, and thread. In the long quiet of Conquest, these were the ones who remembered out loud, even if they did so under their breath. Their resistance wasn't an army. It was a memory. And memory, when passed from hand to hand, is sometimes the only rebellion that survives. Imagine an old Armenian woman in a village near Lake Van. She owns nothing but a carved wooden comb, a lamp made from bone, and a book of psalms written in a language few now speak. She teaches her granddaughter to light the lamp at dusk and run the comb through her hair 3 times while reciting a single verse. She doesn't explain the verse. She doesn't say it aloud, but her hands repeat the motions, night after night, in defiance of the silence around her. Or think of a Coptic monk in a cave in Upper Egypt. The churches in his village have long since been converted or closed. He has no congregation. But each morning, before the sun rises, he takes a lump of clay and shapes it into a tiny cross. Then he crushes it and buries the dust in the sand, over and over, not for anyone to see, but because some part of him refuses to forget. These are not traumatic acts, but they are heavy with meaning, because when history is erased at the level of law, architecture, language, and even self-image, the smallest repeated act becomes sacred. In Andalusia, a Jewish calligrapher copied ancient legal texts in miniature, hiding them in the bindings of Quranic manuscripts. He had memorized the structure of Islamic verse, so he knew where the margins fell. He laid his history beside another scripture, not to challenge it, but to ensure both survived. The manuscript was never opened in his lifetime. But in the 19th century, during a restoration of a damaged volume in Seville, a conservator found the tiny, invisible pages folded into the spine. History had waited. In Persia, a Zoroastrian midwife prepared newborns not just with Islamic prayers, as required, but with a whisper of Avestan blessing spoken, as if humming a lullaby, her lips barely moving. She had no books. She had only a memory. But for decades, she blessed every child she touched, Muslim or not, with a language that the state said was dead. In India, Hindu temple dancers, forbidden to perform, adapted their gestures into wedding ceremonies and household rituals. The mudras, the sacred hand signs, became part of serving tea, of offering sweets, of cleaning doorsteps. No one noticed, but the gods did not forget, even when their statues were buried in pits, even when their names were forbidden, even when their temples became barracks. And then there were the songs, some in Aramaic, some in Berber, some in Kurdish, dialects so old they could not be written down. These songs were rarely performed in public. They were sung to children, hummed during funerals, and chanted while weaving or grinding grain. Each note is a syllable of a world not yet dead. Each voice is a thread connecting the present to a time before conquest. And sometimes the resistance came not in preserving the old, but in telling the truth about the new. An Andalusian poet in the court of a Muslim governor wrote verses celebrating spring. But if you read carefully, every stanza ended with a word, borrowed from Hebrew or Latin. It was subtle, almost invisible, but those who knew. Another poet, this time in Baghdad, began ending his love poems with names that did not appear in Islamic histories, names of vanished Christian saints, Zoroastrian martyrs, or unnamed children found in ledgers of the enslaved. He was never censored. The officials thought his names were metaphors, but they were graves. Even merchants resisted. A Jewish goldsmith in Isfahan melted tiny Torah scrolls into the backs of pendants, embedding them beneath enamel. When asked why his jewelry shimmered strangely, he simply smiled. "It catches the light differently," he said. It caught memory, too. And sometimes the resistance took no form at all, just a refusal. A refusal to speak the new language. At home, a refusal to eat certain foods. A refusal to forget a name, a date, a color. One family in Damascus kept a lock of hair wrapped in parchment for 400 years. No one remembered whose it was, but the wrapping said, "Before they took him." That was enough, because even without the full story, the wound still whispered, and the whispers accumulated, generation by generation, until eventually someone wrote them down. A granddaughter, a student, a stranger. A curious mind finds a scrap of paper and asks why. And this is where you come in. Because if you've listened this far, you've become part of that resistance. You've opened a door into a room many would prefer to stay sealed. You've let in air, and air carries breath, and breath carries voice. And voice, once heard, is hard to bury again. But we must be gentle, because the next part of this journey leads us deeper, not into cruelty, but into comfort, into how the conquerors saw themselves, how they rationalized, how they painted their own hands clean, how they made room in their minds for beauty, law, and devotion, even as others crumbled beneath their rule. It is not a story of monsters, but of men who believed they were righteous. And those are always the hardest truths to hold. So breathe softly. Let your mind grow still. Because next, we enter the mirror, the one where power believes it is good. And we must look. Even if the reflection is sharp. Now, let us stand before the mirror of the conqueror, not to accuse, but to observe. Because power rarely sees itself as cruel. It often imagines itself as merciful, wise, even enlightened. And when an empire stretches its arms across deserts and rivers, across languages and faiths, it must tell itself a story in which conquest is salvation, control is order, and submission is peace. This story was not whispered in shadows. It was declared from pulpits, inscribed into scrolls, chanted in courts, and stitched into tapestries. And within that story, the Islamic Caliphates cast themselves not as destroyers, but as custodians of civilization, of truth, of divine will. Imagine a caliph seated in his marble hall, the air thick with incense and scribes waiting at attention. He is told that a Christian bishop has refused to demolish an ancient church to make way for a new road. The caliph sighs. He recites a verse about justice. Then he signs an order to increase the bishop's tax threefold. Let him keep his church, he says, but let him remember his place. And in his heart he feels merciful, because the bishop still lives. The church still stands. That, to him, is tolerance. Not equality, just survival. Now picture a qadi, a judge, in Fez. A young Jewish boy has been beaten in the market by a Muslim merchant. The case comes before him. The evidence is clear. The merchant admits guilt. The judge nods, then issues a small fine, not for violence, but for disrupting public order. He tells the boy's father, "Be grateful this land allows your people to walk freely at all." The judge believes he has done well. The boy wasn't whipped. No one was executed. The law has prevailed, but the bruises stay. And the message, unspoken but deeply felt, is that fairness is not a right. It is a favor. It's a favor. And favors can be withdrawn. Even scholars, those most trusted with truth, joined this reflective illusion. They wrote glowing accounts of the caliph's justice, of their patronage of knowledge, and their care for the poor. And many of these things were true if you belonged to the right faith. The libraries were indeed vast. The architecture is awe-inspiring. Science, poetry, and medicine flourished. But none of this beauty was shared equally. Access to schools, courts, and even water was limited by belief. And yet the scholars rarely mentioned this. Why? Not out of fear, but out of faith. Faith in the system. Faith that their civilization was the pinnacle of divine order. To question it would be to question God. So they didn't, and they passed. That confidence to their students, and those students to their own. Until a whole intellectual class existed that believed cruelty was not just necessary, but good, efficient, sacred. One historian wrote, "The dummy is like the shadow of the believer. He walks behind, silent and cool." Another, "We give them life, and in return they give us gold. Is that not justice?" These are not the writings of tyrants. They are the words of men in robes, with ink-stained fingers and calm voices. And yet, their words helped sustain a system that bled others. Dry, because when power smiles, it often cannot see its teeth. Even poets joined this self-adoration. Verse after verse praising the caliphate as a lantern of the world, a shelter for the weary, a garden of wisdom in the desert of unbelief. They wrote, of swords dipped not in blood, but in light, of conquests that healed the land. And sometimes they even compared non-Muslims to children wayward, stubborn, but ultimately in need of guidance. This was not satire. It was sincerity. They truly believed that their rule was better, that forced conversions were invitations, that jizya was purification, that slavery was rehabilitation. It is hard to fathom now, but that is how most empires think, not in gore, but in grandeur. And yet, the cracks were always there. Beneath the marble, blood. Behind the poetry, silence. Below the mosques, foundations. Laid by forgotten hands. There were always moments fleeting, fragile when someone noticed. A soldier who hesitated before dragging a child from her mother's arms. A clerk who paused over a ledger of names, wondering why some were marked with red ink. A servant who buried a stolen scroll rather than burn it. Small acts. Tiny ruptures. in the grand illusion. And perhaps these are what saved memory from vanishing completely. Because not everyone swallowed the story. Some choked on it, quietly, alone. And from those small rebellions came the seeds of doubt. And from doubt, the slow return of truth. But we're not there yet. The illusion of mercy still stands, strong, convincing, even in our time. Because modern retellings often echo the same narrative, that Islamic rule, while imperfect, was more tolerant than others. It provided stability, law, and culture. And in many ways, it did. But what was the cost? And more importantly, who paid it? The ones not in the histories, not on the plaques, not in the stained glass. They paid with their names, their songs, their bodies, their beliefs, and their children's memories. That cost matters. And in the next part, we will travel with those children, those who inherited the silence, who grew up Muslim but with shadows in their homes, stories their parents wouldn't tell, names erased from family trees, graves unmarked, languages forgotten mid-sentence. Their lives were peaceful, but beneath that peace was a wound no one would name. And perhaps that's where we begin to see the full shape of erasure. Not just what happened, but what was never spoken again. So breathe, slowly, let your body soften, because what comes next is not loud. It is the ache that lingers after a history has been swept clean, and the silence that grows in its place. Now let us walk beside the children of the silence, not the ones who resisted, nor the ones who conquered, but those born after, into houses where nothing seemed broken, and yet something was missing. These were the children who grew up under domes and dates and prayer calls, with fathers who prayed and mothers who sang, but when they asked where their grandfather came from, or what the strange word their aunt used to say meant, the answers were either, "We don't talk about that," or "It doesn't matter anymore." And so, generation by generation, the silence became furniture, comfortable, decorative, unquestioned. Imagine a boy in 16th century Aleppo. His name is Yusuf. He studies the Quran, learns Arabic calligraphy, and plays in the narrow alleyways, where carpets hang from walls like veils. He is kind. He is clever. But in his grandmother's room, there is a small shelf of objects, rusted keys, a faded cloth with an embroidered symbol he does not recognize, and a broken pendant carved with a star. "What is this?" he asks. His grandmother smiles faintly, then says, "Old things from before." He senses not to press, and so he doesn't. But something remains. A quiet itch in the back of his thoughts. A missing piece. He grows, marries, and becomes a respected man. But he never tells his children about that shelf. One day, he buries the pendant in the garden, just to be safe. Now, picture a girl in Isfahan. Her name is Lele. She speaks Farsi, studies astronomy, and loves painting. Her family is Muslim, devout but not harsh. Yet sometimes, at night, her mother lights a candle and hums a melody that is not in any prayer book. Layla asks once, "What is that song?" Her mother says nothing, only snuffs. The flame. Years later, Layla will hum it again, during childbirth, without knowing why. And thus the silence carries forward, not as denial, but as an absence. These children live peaceful lives. They are not persecuted. They are not rebels. But they carry within them a fracture, a thin line between who they are and who they could have been. And they do not know where it comes from. A boy grows up speaking Arabic, but dreams in Aramaic, though he doesn't know the language. A girl weeps during certain hymns without understanding why. A man feels an ache when he walks past a ruined building that everyone else ignores. These are not ghosts. These are echoes. The inherited tremors of memory are erased but not extinguished. And as centuries pass, the echoes become faint, until they are no longer even noticed. A family removes the last relic from a shelf. A child's name is chosen without reference to ancestral languages. A burial is performed with the rituals of the present, not the whispered rites of the past. And with each small erasure, the silence becomes more complete, but not perfect, because something always remains. A poem found in a box, a carving on a doorframe, a faded letter sewn into a cloak. And then, in our time, a descendant opens a book or visits a ruin, or hears a name in a dream, and the silence cracks. Just a little. And when it does, questions pour in. Who were we before this? Why did we stop speaking that language? Why does no one remember where our family was in the year 1300? And the silence, startled, begins to retreat. Not fast, not completely, but it trembles. Because silence, for all its weight, fears attention. It survives by being unnoticed, by becoming the default, by wrapping itself in respect, in tradition, in loyalty. But when a child looks at their mother and says, "Tell me the real story," the silence shudders, because it knows it cannot last forever. It was built to endure, but not to grow. And memory, once watered, grows like a vine. And so today, in the 21st century, we see the vines return. A scholar finds a tax ledger in an archive and wonders why 400 names disappear in a single year. A tourist stumbles upon a ruined fire temple in Yazd and asks why the stones are so clean, too clean. A singer in Morocco uncovers a melody that matches a Jewish wedding song sung in Lithuania. How did it get there? Who carried it across the sands? Why was it hidden in plain sight? These questions ripple backward. They awaken old threads. And suddenly, history is no longer what we thought. The silence is no longer absolute. And for the children of the silence, this is both wonder and pain. Because to rediscover what was lost is to mourn it anew. To know that your ancestors were erased is to grieve them, even if you never met them. And yet, it is also liberation. Because once you name the silence, it loses power. Once you see the erased, they begin to return. In the story, in song, in stone. And so, in the next part, we will return to the present, not to close the book, but to trace the final shadows of this long silence into our modern lives. Into the textbooks we read, the cities we walk, the prayers we say, and the things we forget without even realizing. So close your eyes, if you like. Let your breath slow. Because we are approaching the softest part of all the part where forgetting ends and remembering begins. Quietly, patiently, as all truths must. Now let us drift gently into the streets we know modern cities with cafes and cars, where the sound of a call to prayer echoes between glass buildings and no one looks up, where children scroll on phones and wear t-shirts with English slogans, and no one remembers what language their great-grandmother cried in. These are not places of war. They are places of normal. But beneath the smooth asphalt and freshly painted mosques, the silence of Conquest still hums like an old refrigerator background noise, constant, unacknowledged. In cities like Cairo, Damascus, Lahore, Baghdad, Istanbul, and even Paris, and London, you can walk for miles without realizing you are stepping on the bones of forgotten names. But now and then, something breaks through. A plaque too vague. A church turned warehouse with no sign. A family whose surname ends abruptly at 1842. These are not accidents. They are symptoms of a historical quiet so deep that even its echoes are shy. Take the case of textbooks. Open one in a Muslim-majority country. Flip to the chapter on Islamic empires. You will find glory. The Abbasids' libraries, the Ottomans' architecture, the Mughals' art, and much of it is real, sincere achievements, of beauty and intellect, but missing are the voices beneath. There is no mention of the Armenian caravan that disappeared on the road to Aleppo, no paragraph on the Coptic children who are not allowed to wear shoes in the presence of Muslims, no footnote for the women whose temples were turned into stables, nor the libraries, burned not by flame, but by decree. Instead, the narrative is clean, polished, comforting, and comforting stories are the most dangerous when they are half true. Now consider architecture. In many cities, a mosque stands proud, but look closer, and you might find Roman pillars repurposed from a basilica, or a foundation stone with Hebrew etchings. These pieces do not lie, but they are not explained. And so, the average passerby assumes they are a coincidence, not inheritance. One historian called this architectural amnesia, a practice of building over the old without truly burying it, just ignoring it politely. Even in language, the silence continues. The Persian word for church, kalisa, is used without thought. Few realize it comes from the Syriac ekelsib, the same root as the Greek ecclesia. The language remembers. The people often do not. And what of law? Many modern legal systems in the Islamic world still reflect the remnants of the old hierarchies. Though dhimmi laws are largely repealed, their shadows remain in bureaucracy, in social expectation, in marriage contracts, in inheritance codes. In some places, a non-Muslim still cannot testify against a Muslim in a religious court. In others, conversion to Islam instantly overrides a family's prior religion for children. These are not loud injustices. They are technicalities. But technicalities build cages just as well as chains. And in families, too, the silence lingers. A boy asks why his grandmother lights 2 candles every Friday, and she says it's just tradition. A girl wonders why her surname sounds Jewish, and her uncle chuckles, "Long story," then changes the subject. A father tells his son to never mention that old family rumor about ancestors who were fire worshippers. It's all in the past, he says, and yet the past leaks through dreams, through old recipes, through a carving on a spoon that no one can read, but no one throws away. Some families guard these remnants like relics. Others hide their shame, but both are forms of reverence. Because even when memory is forbidden, it is rarely extinguished. And in recent years, some have begun to ask aloud, what was lost? And why can't we say their names? This is not an attack on faith. It is an invitation to honesty, to complexity, to sit with the discomfort that your story, your glory, your mosque, your flag may have been built atop someone else's silence. That doesn't make you evil. It makes you responsible. Because once you know, you cannot unknow. And once you ask, you begin to see. The closed door that used to be a synagogue. The courtyard that once held prayers in Sanskrit. The name of a street, slightly mispronounced, turns out to be a saint's. These details do not accuse. They whisper, they remind. They ask to be included, not erased again. But to include them, you must first hear them. And to hear them, you must grow quiet. So let us do that. Let us sit for a moment, wherever you are, in a chair, on a bed, on a floor. Let the air settle. Listen to the hum of your room, the buzz of your thoughts, the weight of your breath. Because in the next part, we will go deeper, still not into the past, but into the softest spaces where history lives without being noticed. Into lullabies, into food, into rituals you thought were just ours, but were borrowed, lended, and carried. There in the smallest gestures, we will find the deepest truths. So stay with me. Let your eyes grow heavy if they wish, because the next truth is not loud. It is folded into the warmth of home, and it's been waiting very patiently to be remembered. Now let us enter the house, not the grand palaces or ruined temples, but the ordinary home where meals are prepared, clothes are folded, and stories are told only with glances. For it is here, within the soft rhythm of domestic life, that history hides most deeply. Not in books, but in the way spices are added, or how water is poured before a meal, or why a certain cloth is kept in a drawer no one opens. These gestures are not written in any scripture, and yet they survive. They carry the weight of what came before, sometimes unknowingly, because conquest does not just erase, it replaces. It takes the old and covers it with new language, new rituals, new names. But the bones of the old still press through the skin of habit. And nowhere is this clearer than in food. Imagine a dish in Baghdad, slow cooked with lamb, raisins, and cinnamon. It is served at weddings and religious feasts. But few remember that it once marked the new year in a Zoroastrian home. The ingredients are the same. The hands stirring it are different. Or picture a sweet bread in Egypt, braided and dusted with sesame. It is baked for Eid, shared among neighbors. But the shape it echoes a Coptic cross. The recipe changed slightly, but not entirely. It was too delicious to vanish. So it stayed, renamed, recontextualized, but quietly defiant. And then there are the lullabies, hummed by Muslim mothers, cradling babies in darkened rooms. Songs about stars and light and safety. But in some homes, the melody is older than the language. A tune comes from a Jewish hymn or a Nestorian chant. The lyrics have changed, but the music remembers. And the baby, drifting into sleep, inherits both conquest and resistance in a single breath. Even in clothing, the traces persist. In Persia, long after fire temples were closed, some women continued to wear a red thread during childbirth, a talisman of ancient protection. They no longer knew why, only that their mothers had done it, and their grandmothers too. The meaning was erased, but the practice endured. In North Africa, a particular embroidery stitched zigzag, dense, and spiraled appears on garments for both Muslim and Jewish brides. No one knows which community first invented it, because once shared, some things become woven into the land itself. And what of names? Many families adopted Arabic names over time, whether by force, by convenience, or by faith. But in whispered moments, older names linger. A grandmother still calls her daughter by a nickname no one else uses. A boy finds an inscription on a ring letters unfamiliar, yet comforting. A father refuses to name his son after a caliph, choosing instead the name of a forgotten mountain. These small acts are not loud, but they are stubborn. And even rituals, the washing of feet, the lighting of oil, the blessing over grain, bear echoes of older devotions. Islam, like all faiths, absorbed what came before, and in doing so, it carried forward pieces of what it replaced. Not always kindly, not always knowingly, but carried nonetheless. And now, centuries later, we live inside this blend. A mosaic sealed with silence. Some fragments sparkle, others are dulled by time, but together they tell the full story. And if we ignore the older tiles, if we focus only on the new, then we miss the beauty and the warning. Because every erased person, every forgotten tongue, once believed they would be remembered, once thought their rituals eternal. Their gods are unshakable, their names carved in stone. And yet here we are using their recipes, singing their seas. Tunes, wearing their patterns and not knowing. That is the deepest layer of conquest, not destruction. But the transformation is so complete that the victim forgets they were ever separate. And yet, part of them remains, in the color of a spice, in the twist of a dance, in the hush before a prayer. They are not gone, just folded in, waiting, And sometimes all it takes is a question to unfold them again. A child asking, "Why? Do we eat this on Fridays?" A cook wonders, "Where did this technique come from?" A musician hearing a note that doesn't belong and following it backward through time. And when that happens, the silence loosens. The house shifts. The air changes. And the home becomes not just a shelter, but a museum, a sanctuary, a vessel of many forgotten lives. So tonight, as you sit or lie or drift, listen to your gestures, the way you prepare for sleep, the last words you whisper, the fabric you pull over your shoulders. Somewhere in those acts is a history you didn't know you carried. And in the next part, we will step outside again, not into the past, but into the modern cities that now sit atop thousands of years of forgetting. Places where erasure is paved over by highways and history is marketed in gift shops. And yet, if we look with soft eyes, we might still see the shadows walking beside us, waiting to be known. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders sink, because we are not finished. The present holds more silence than we think, and we are just beginning to hear it. Now let us walk into the modern city, not the ancient ruins, not the preserved old quarter, but the parts with blinking traffic lights, glass towers, coffee shops with Wi-Fi passwords and menus in English. These are the cities we call home now, or visit, or pass through without stopping. Cities where the past is carefully managed, where heritage is curated into brochures and museum gift shops, where history is shaped not for remembering, but for comfort. In such places, forgetting is not an accident. It is a design. You walk through a plaza in Istanbul, perhaps eat roasted corn beneath the minarets, admire the symmetry of the Blue Mosque, and maybe a tour guide tells you this was once Constantinople. But he won't say that thousands of Greek, Armenian, and Jewish residents were expelled, forced to convert, or slowly squeezed out by laws that changed just enough to make their presence unbearable. Instead, it will sound like a seamless transition. Byzantium became Constantinople, then Istanbul, like pages turning in a well-written book. No mess, no screams, no ash. Just change. In Damascus, you might sip coffee near the Umayyad Mosque, not knowing it was built atop a Roman temple, which was built atop an Aramean one. You will hear the call to prayer echo off marble that once knew chants in Latin and whispers in ancient Semitic tongues, and the ground will not protest, because stone forgets loudly, but people forget softly. In Cairo, you'll see Fatimid arches and Ottoman domes, all preserved beautifully. But you might not be told about the destruction of churches, the double taxes on Christians, or the quiet flight of entire communities over centuries. Or how Coptic script faded, not because it was outlawed, but because it was slowly made useless. The same pattern repeats in Cordoba, in Lahore, in Baghdad. History is shown through angles, lighting, and selective captions. Tolerance says one plaque. Golden Age, says another. And to question, this is not welcome. It is seen as disrespectful, ungrateful, even blasphemous. But history is not dishonored by honesty. It is strengthened by it, yet the silence persists. Not because it is true, but because it is easier. Even in digital spaces, Wikipedia articles, YouTube documentaries, school syllabi, the story is streamlined. Islamic empires are praised for their intellectual flourishing, their art, and their relative tolerance compared to others. And there is truth there. But an incomplete truth is a knife wrapped in silk. It hides the edge. And so, the modern city becomes a performance. A stage where only certain ancestors are allowed to speak, where certain stones are polished and others left to crumble, where the old names are translated and the oldest ones simply left out, but the ghosts remain, in street names that no one can pronounce, in locked doors with Hebrew inscriptions, in neighborhoods with no official origin, but a lingering accent. Sometimes a new restaurant opens in an old quarter and finds that its neighbors leave offerings by the doorstep every Friday. Why? The owner asks. We don't know, they say. It's just what's always been done. In such details, the past tugs gently. In such shadows, the erased breathe. Even tourism becomes complicit. A tourist walks through the Alhambra and admires the tiles, not knowing they were once walked by Jewish philosophers in Muslim courts until both were banished. A traveler visits the ruins of a fire temple in Yazd, unaware that 1,000 years ago, the flames were never allowed to die. Now the temple is a photo stop, the fire an exhibit. But to some, it was once the heart of the world. And this loss, the transformation of faith into deco, is perhaps the final erasure. Not destruction, but display. History turned into an aesthetic. Suffering flattened into architecture. Memory compressed into bullet points. And yet, the silence is not perfect. Because in every city, there is someone who still knows. A janitor who mutters a prayer in a dead language. A librarian who saves a crumbling map no one else can read. A grandmother who still ties her headscarf. A certain way, not because of Islam, but because her mother did it that way, before the word hijab was even used in their home. These are the last guardians, the ones who carry memory not in books, but in bone. And when they die, something is lost. But not everything, because someone always watches. A curious child, a respectful student, a stranger who asks, why do you do that? And in that question, the silence stirs again. And so, in the next part, we will sit with the aftermath, the emotional inheritance of erasure. What it does to the soul to grow up without a story. How it feels to belong to a culture built on forgetting. And what it means to reclaim not just facts, but feelings. The ache of the unnamed. The grief of the almost remembered. Let your breathing deepen. Let your body soften. Because where we are going now is not in the books. It is in the space between questions. The quiet between names. The stillness where memory returns first as longing, then as truth. Now let us enter the tender, fragile realm of emotional inheritance. The part of history not written in ink, but carried in hearts, in gestures, in that vague sensation that something is missing, even when life seems whole. Because when silence is passed down long enough, it stops sounding like silence. It becomes normal, natural, expected, and those born into it do not know they are missing anything until the ache arrives quiet, persistent, unnamed. Picture a young woman in modern Cairo. She has a good life, a steady job, prayers 5 times a day, a mother who loves her, and a father who reads hadith before bed. But sometimes when she visits the old part of town and walks past a sealed church door, she feels something. Not sadness exactly, more like recognition. Her hand tingles, her breath slows. She cannot explain it. She never enters the church. She never speaks of it, but it happens every time. Or imagine a boy in Damascus studying architecture. He is proud of his city's heritage, knows the timeline of every caliph, every dynasty. But once, while restoring an old home, he finds a carved star above a door frame delicate, 6-pointed, surrounded by faint Hebrew. He pauses, takes a photo, shows no one, deletes it later. But that night, he dreams of candles and chanting. He doesn't understand, and he wakes up crying, not in fear, in longing. This is the quiet grief of the erased, to miss something you never knew you had, to hunger for a story that was cut before your chapter began, to feel your body respond to a word, a symbol, a sound, and not know why. This grief is not loud. It has no memorial, no flag, no date. It passes silently, like a shadow behind the eyes. And it lives not only in individuals, but in communities. A city that once celebrated a spring festival now forbids music during that season, without remembering why. A village that used to bake a special bread on the solstice now calls it winter sweet and frowns when asked about its origin. A family that used to whisper blessings to the moon now scolds children for looking at it too long. These shifts are subtle, but they carry sorrow, because they signal a break between the past and the present, a bridge burned and paved over, and yet the feelings remain. A child's fear of certain symbols, a woman's unexplained comfort in buildings made of stone, not plaster, a man who weeps at the sound of a language he does not speak. These are the echoes, and to feel them is to carry a wound whose cause is hidden. But emotional memory is patient. It does not vanish with logic. It lives in the nervous system, in the breath, in the curl of fingers during sleep. And sometimes, without warning, it rises. During music, during dreams, during moments of great joy or great pain. And when it does, it asks no questions. It only says, I am here. I have always been here. For some, this is terrifying. It disrupts the neatness of identity. It raises questions about ancestry, faith, and loyalty. But for others, it is a gift, because it offers depth, complexity, the realization that one's bloodline is not a straight line, but a tapestry with threads of many colors, some faded, some vivid, some frayed at the edge. And that knowledge, even if painful, brings wholeness. Wholeness. To say, my ancestors were not only Muslims, but Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, pagans, is not betrayal. It is true. And truth, once embraced, sets the spirit free. It allows one to mourn what was lost, not just intellectually, but emotionally. To cry for the grandmothers who forgot their mother tongue, for the unmarked graves of priests and poets, for the children renamed at sword point, for the songs silenced. And in that mourning, there is healing. Because healing requires honesty, and honesty requires courage. And courage begins in softness. So if tonight you feel something stir within you, something you cannot name, know that it is not random. It is history awakening. It is memory returning without anger. It comes not to accuse, but to be held, to be acknowledged, to be forgiven. And in the next part, we will finally return to the erased, not as victims, but as presences. We will speak of those who survived even silence, who carried their identities quietly, subtly, defiantly, who found ways to leave traces, codes, symbols, gestures that endured beyond conquest. Their stories were not written in books, but they are written in you. So breathe gently. You are part of this, even if you don't know how. Let the past settle like dust on your skin. It means no harm. It only wants to be seen. Now let us open our eyes to the quiet survivors, not the rebels who fought in open battle, not the chroniclers who wrote in grand language, but the ones who endured through subtlety, whose resistance was quiet, soft, woven into the very patterns of daily life. These were the forgotten priests who became gardeners, the firekeepers who disguised their rites as chores, the teachers who taught forbidden scripts under the guise of geometry. They did not lead armies or write manifestos. They preserved by blending, by hiding, by whispering at the right moment and falling silent at the wrong one. Their names are mostly lost, but their methods remain etched into the behavior of 1,000 unnoticed hands. Consider the weavers of Persia, who continued to knot ancient symbols into their rugs, even when asked to remove all references to Zoroastrian fire or pre-Islamic mythology. They simply made the flames smaller. They turned the gods into birds. They hid their cosmology in color, and when questioned, they smiled and said, "It's just tradition." Or take the Jewish goldsmiths in Ottoman towns, who were forbidden from building new synagogues or ringing bells. So instead, they crafted jewelry shaped like sacred objects, a pendant with 6 points, a clasp shaped like the Hebrew letter shin, not loud, not illegal, just ... quietly persistent. And when those artisans converted under pressure, some continued making the same objects, now for aesthetic reasons, but the shape did not lie. In kitchens, too, survival whispered. In every recipe, passed down with the phrase, "Don't tell anyone where this comes from." In every ritual that happened, just because grandmother did it that way, there lived a thread of refusal. A woman boiling eggs with ash on the spring equinox. A man lighting a candle before traveling, not for prayer, but for luck. A child 'tis old to place water at the doorstep during full moons. When asked why, the answer was always vague. But the act endured. Even gestures held power. The touching of 2 fingers to the heart. The circular motion is made over food before eating. The kiss blown toward the setting sun. These are not Islamic traditions, nor are they un-Islamic. They are something older, woven into newer lives, passed down without labels. And in this lies their strength, because silence cannot erase what is unnamed. And identity, when hidden in plain sight, often survives the longest. Now consider the storytellers. In many cities, banned from printing or public teaching, some minority elders took up the role of entertainers. They told folktales, allegories wrapped in humor, often featuring animals or mythical lands. But beneath the surface, their stories carried history. A fox escaping a lion by pretending to be a bird, a tale of hidden faith. A donkey who forgets its name after drinking from a well, an allegory for forced conversion. A tree that remembers the footsteps of a vanished people, a symbol of collective memory. The children laughed, the adults nodded, and the stories lived on. In song 2, survival bloomed. A lullaby sung in Ladino in a Muslim home. A wedding chant borrowed from Aramaic verses. A morning song with syllables that mean nothing in Arabic, but match a prayer from a vanished rite. The melodies were never banned, only the meanings. So they were sung anyway, stripped of language, but not of soul. These soft survivors, artists, cooks, tailors, mothers, were not recognized in history books. But they are the reason memory endures. Because they carried it not in books or buildings, but in their bodies, their habits, their silence. They did not need to win. They only needed to continue. And now, centuries later, we live in their echo. We hum their tunes. We eat their food. We repeat their gestures without knowing. And some of us, on rare nights like this, pause and wonder, where did this come from? And the past answers not in words, but in feeling. A tug of familiarity, a chill, a warmth, a sense of being seen by something ancient. And so, in the final part, we will return to that silence, not as a villain, but as a space. A space we have lived inside without questioning. A space we are now beginning to see. We will close the story with a breath not of despair, but of gentle reckoning. Because the cruelest thing the Islamic Caliphates did to conquered peoples was not always the tax, or the sword, or the exile. Sometimes it was the silence that followed. The way they vanished was not by dying, but by being folded so tightly into the conqueror's story that even their memory forgot how to speak. But tonight, you have heard them. Not in shouts, but in sighs. Not in facts, but in feelings. And now you carry them too. Let your eyes soften. Let the night return. Because the final part awaits, and it will not bring a conclusion, but an invitation. One you've already begun to accept. Quietly, with your breath. Now let us return to the silence, not the beginning, not the peak, but the stillness that lingers after centuries have passed, and the world has reshaped itself so many times that no one quite knows what the original shape was. This is not the silence of death or defeat. It is the silence of forgetting, polished over so many generations that it gleams like marble clean, cold, elegant. And yet, beneath it, the old voices still breathe. You have walked with them now through kitchens and ruins, through lullabies and hidden carvings, through cities that do not know what they stand upon. You have met their shadows in doorways, in recipes, in dreams. And as we reach the end of this slow unfolding, perhaps the question is not, what happened to them? But what happens to us, now that we know? Because once you hear the silence, you cannot unhear it. It colors every step, every street, every story. The cruelty of the Islamic Caliphates was not only in the sword or the tax ledger or the broken altar. It was in the systematic refusal to acknowledge what was lost. It was in the rewriting of memory, not with fire, but with ink softly, calmly, just enough to shift the story. It was in the way conversion became a ladder, a rescue, a new beginning, and never a tearing, never a wound. It was in the way the descendants of the conquered were invited to speak, but only in the conqueror's tongue. But this story is not just theirs. It is also ours. It is yours if you live in a house where traditions are followed without meaning. It is yours if you come from a place with too many layers and too few explanations. It is yours if your name is Arabic, but your grandmother's eyes do not look like the rest of your family's. It is yours if you feel a sense of home in places you've never been. If you cry when a song in an unfamiliar scale plays. If you've ever looked in the mirror and seen someone older, stranger, waiting behind your eyes. And what now? Do we grieve? Do we accuse? Do we peel back every layer and scream for justice? Perhaps, but perhaps also we listen. We ask. We sit with unease, because beneath every act of erasure, something remains. Not defiant, not even resistant, just patient, waiting. A stone in the courtyard that doesn't match. A name in the genealogy chart that no one can explain. A ritual that feels too ancient to belong where it does. These are the threads, the clues, the invitations. And when we follow them, gently, we do not undo the silence, but we soften its edges. We make space within it. We plant seeds in its cracks. That is how memory returns, not with thunder, but with repetition, with questions, with the courage to sit in discomfort and still say, "Tell me more." And so we end not with closure, but with an open door, a breath, a room in your mind you haven't entered in years. And maybe tonight, after this story, you will. Maybe you will ask your parents what your family spoke before, Arabic. Maybe you will research the oldest religion of your village. Maybe you will remember a childhood game that makes more sense now. Or maybe you will do nothing, just sleep, just rest. That too is sacred, because healing does not require haste. It only requires awareness. And now you are aware. So let your breath slow. Let your hands rest. Let your thoughts drift like smoke across a ruined courtyard. And if your eyes are closed now, know this: you are not alone. Around the world, others are listening. Others are remembering. Others are beginning to see the outlines of what was once lost. Together, in this quiet remembering, we begin to build a new story, not to replace what was taken, but to carry it forward with tenderness, with humility, with truth. The night is deep now. The silence is soft. And in that silence, something sacred stirs. Not a god, not a battle, not a nation, just memory. Just breathe, just you. Still here, still listening, still enough. Good night. Now let us linger here, in the quiet that follows, knowing not the sharp, immediate knowing of a discovery, but the slow, dawning kind that wraps itself around your life gently, like morning mist curling over rooftops you've walked beneath 1,000 times without noticing. After all the ruins and recipes, the vanished names and half-remembered prayers, the question now is softer. What do we do with this awareness that so much of what we are has been shaped by silence? That so many of our habits and identities stand upon the quiet wreckage of others? The truth is, history doesn't ask for guilt. It asks for a now. Let us return not to the past, not to the moment of conquest or silence, not even to the names and faces we tried to remember, but to the quiet place within you where all of this now lives. You have listened to a story woven, not from dates or dynasties, but from fragments and feelings, from lost languages and lingering habits, from forgotten altars and secret recipes. And in doing so, you have done something that not even empires could erase. You have remembered, softly, patiently, without needing proof, without needing permission. You have made space for what was never supposed to return. And it did. Not in anger, not with thunder, but like the slow breath of someone who has finally stopped holding it. That is the power of witness, not to change the past, but to invite it to rest beside you, no longer clawing for acknowledgement, no longer aching to be known, just resting, safe with you. And in that stillness, something else awakens. A sense of continuity, of rootedness, not in pride or nationalism, but in tenderness. You are not a blank slate. You are a vessel, and inside you lives the sacred, dust of many lives, some sung in mosques, some wept in temples, some danced in fields where the moon once mattered more than any king. You are not just the story you were told. You are also the story that was silenced. And now, even if you speak no ancient tongue, even if your lineage is a blur, you carry something holy. The memory of those who endured through gesture, through food, through silence, through love. You may never know their names, but you know their presence, because it lives in the small things, the way you stir your tea, the rhythm of your footsteps on an old street, the longing you feel when you smell something unfamiliar yet comforting, the pause before you speak a blessing. These are not accidents. They are echoes, and tonight you have listened to them, you have honored them. You have given shape to a grief that was never allowed to weep, and in doing so, you have not broken the silence. You have softened it, and within that softness, there is room. Room for nuance, room for complexity, room for grace. So as this journey comes to its close, do not look for resolution. Look for reverence. The kind that allows you to sleep, not because all questions are answered, but because all questions are welcome. The kind that holds contradiction without shame. The kind that says, yes, I am descended from conquerors and the conquered, and both deserve to be remembered. That is your inheritance. Not dominance, not denial, but depth. And with that depth, you move forward gentler, slower, more aware. You will walk past a ruin and feel its breath. You will hear a child's name and wonder what language it used to be. You will taste something old and think, who first made this? These small thoughts are prayers. They are the restoration of what was meant to disappear. And now, perhaps your eyes are closed. Perhaps you are already dreaming. Or perhaps you sit in the quiet, letting the last words settle into your chest. However you are, know this. You are part of the story now, not as a historian, not as a judge, but as a keeper, a soft, curious, listening heart. And that is enough. Thank you for carrying this silence with care. Thank you for not turning away. Thank you for making space. And if your breath is steady now, if your room is dim and your shoulders light, then let the night have you. Let the past sleep. Let the future wait. You are here, whole, listening, remembering, and remembered. Good night. Witness. And to witness is not simply to observe, but to acknowledge with the body, with the breath, with the way we fold our hands or speak a name or notice a stone. In this gentle noticing, there is a kind of justice, not the kind written in laws or demanded in courts, but the quiet kind, the kind that offers space. Tonight, you have made space, and in that space, others return not in anger, but in fragments. A tune you now recognize as older than you were told. A ritual you will repeat with a different awareness. A moment of stillness that feels not empty, but shared. Across North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Central Asia, and even into Europe, the legacy of Islamic Caliphates stretches not just in roads and buildings and borders, but in unspoken stories. In Tunisia, a market vendor sells cloth stitched in a pattern once used by Andalusian Jews. In Iran, a boy chants Quranic verses with perfect rhythm, never knowing that his meter comes from Zoroastrian hymn structure. In Pakistan, a woman lights a clay lamp on her doorstep during the monsoon, unaware that her ancestors did the same long before Islam arrived, praying then not to Allah, but to a rain goddess whose name was never written down. And in each of these moments, the past lives not as a contradiction, but as a continuity. Because the cruelest thing a conquest can do is not destroy you, but make you forget you are ever different. And yet, despite everything, the difference remains. Not as defiance, but as texture, as richness, as the echo that gives depth to the silence. And so, this part of the story is not a lament. It is a restoration. A soft placing back of all the broken pieces, not to reconstruct the exact old shapes, but to honor that they once existed, that they mattered, that their shadows stretch through your spine, whether you know it or not. To be Muslim today is not to be the inheritor of a perfect empire. It is to be the current layer of a deep, complex soil. And within that soil, others are buried, some peacefully, others abruptly. And their roots feed yours. You do not need to mourn that. You only need to admit it. And perhaps say their names, even if they are incomplete. Perhaps light a candle, not in faith, but in memory. Perhaps learn a word in a language your ancestors might have spoken. Perhaps simply pause when you see an old building with a mismatched arch and wonder, who built that part? These are not grand gestures, but they are the beginnings of wholeness. Because the past is not a place you can live, but it is a place you can visit, carefully, with humility. And when you do, you find that the ones you thought were erased are not gone. They were only waiting for your attention, your breath, your willingness to see, and now you do. As we prepare for the final part of this journey, there is no need to carry sorrow with you. Let it rest here, beside the candle we lit in our minds. Let it melt gently into gratitude. Gratitude for the songs that survived, for the bread that was passed down, for the silence that kept watch until you were ready to hear. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let the room wrap around you. Let the questions drift like dust. You have walked through centuries tonight, not with your feet, but with your heart. And in the final part, we will return once more not to history, but to yourself, to the deep, wide place inside you that remembers things you've never lived. The story is not ending. It is softening, preparing for sleep, preparing for the beginning. Now, let us return not to the past, not to the moment of conquest or silence, not even to the names and faces we tried to remember, but to the quiet place within you where all of this now lives. You have listened to a story woven not from dates or dynasties, but from fragments and feelings, from lost languages and lingering habits, from forgotten altars and secret recipes. And in doing so, you have done something that not even empires could erase. You have remembered, softly, patiently, without needing proof, without needing permission. You have made space for what was never supposed to return. And it did, not in anger, not with thunder, but like the slow breath of someone who has finally stopped holding it. That is the power of witness, not to change the past, but to invite it to rest beside you, no longer clawing for acknowledgement, no longer aching to be known, just resting safe with you. And in that stillness, something else awakens. Sense of continuity, of rootedness, not in pride or nationalism, but in tenderness. You are not a blank slate. You are a vessel. And inside you lives the sacred dust of many lives, some sung in mosques, some wept in temples, some danced in fields where the moon once mattered more than any king. You are not just the story you are told. You are also the story that was silenced. And now, even if you speak no ancient tongue, even if your lineage is a blur, you carry something holy. The memory of those who endured through gesture, through food, through silence, through love. You may never know their names, but you know their presence, because it lives in the small things, the way you stir your tea, the rhythm of your footsteps on an old street, the longing you feel when you smell, something unfamiliar yet comforting, the pause before you speak a blessing. These are not accidents. They are echoes. And tonight, you have listened to them. You have honored them. You have given shape to a grief that was never allowed to weep. And in doing so, you have not broken the silence. You have softened it. And within that softness, there is room. Room for nuance. Room for complexity. Room for grace. So as this journey comes to its close, do not look for resolution. Look for reverence. The kind that allows you to sleep, not because all questions are answered, but because all questions are welcome. The kind that holds contradiction without shame. The kind that says, yes, I am descended from conquerors and the conquered. And both deserve to be remembered. That is your inheritance. Not dominance, not denial, but depth. And with that depth, you move forward gentler, slower, more aware. You will walk past a ruin and feel its breath. You will hear a child's name and wonder what language it used to be. You will taste something old and think, who first made this? These small thoughts are prayers. They are the restoration of what was meant to disappear. And now, perhaps your eyes are closed. Perhaps you are already dreaming. Or perhaps you sit in the quiet, letting the last words settle into your chest. However you are, know this. You are part of the story now. Not as a historian, not as a judge, but as a keeper. A soft, curious listening heart. And that is enough. Thank you for carrying this silence with care. Thank you for not turning away. Thank you for making space. And if your breath is steady now, if your room is dim and your shoulders light, then let the night have you. Let the past sleep. Let the future wait. You are here, whole, listening, remembering, and remembered. Good night.